Hello YouTube! In this video I want to present an interesting recent argument against moral realism. The claim is that moral realism is immoral. You morally ought not to be a moral realist. I think this is an interesting argument in its own right, but it's also kind of cool because it turns the tables on a common criticism of anti-realism. Moral realists will sometimes object that anti-realism is morally defective. If what's right or wrong is just a matter of our preferences or desires or values or whatever, if morality is just something we construct, then the claim is morality loses its force. Morality would be arbitrary or groundless. There's nothing we could say to other cultures or other people who do things that we consider morally evil. From an anti-realist point of view, different people just have different values. There's nothing incorrect about endorsing slavery or female genital mutilation. But that kind of position is morally repugnant. Now, I think there are plenty of plausible responses to that sort of argument. But it's a common thought. And I think, even some anti-realists tend to share the view that moral realism, if it were true, would provide a more firm grounding for their moral commitments. That's often seen as one of the benefits of moral realism. So the moral argument undermines this. Far from providing a firm foundation for morality, realism is itself morally problematic. Now, there have been a few different versions of this argument that have appeared in the recent literature. I'm going to present what I think are the core ideas. I'm drawing from Max Hayward's article, Immoral Realism. Now, Hayward's argument focuses specifically on non-naturalist forms of moral realism. If you're not familiar with the distinction between naturalism and non-naturalism, I do have a series on metaethics that introduces these views. But I'll just briefly characterize the difference. So all moral realists believe that moral statements express propositions, that some of these moral propositions are true, and that moral propositions are true or false in virtue of stance-independent moral facts. Morality is discovered, not invented. It's not dependent on our desires or preferences or whatever. So that's something that all realists hold. What non-naturalists add is that the moral facts are not reducible to natural properties. Moral facts are something over and above the natural properties. The usual motivation for this is the thought that moral facts are normative. They concern, what is good, what we ought to do, what we have reason to do. Natural facts, by contrast, are facts about the arrangements and interactions of matter and the causal laws that govern the arrangements and interactions of matter. These are the sort of facts that are uncovered through empirical investigation, and these are not normative. In themselves, they don't tell us anything about what we ought or ought not to do. So, according to moral non-naturalists, moral facts are irreducibly normative. Moral facts cannot be reduced to natural facts. Again, I have videos that do go over this debate in more detail, but that's the basic idea. Now, Hayward's argument specifically targets non-naturalism. He says, and I quote, "To the extent that one believes non-naturalism, one believes something immoral." A little bit later, we'll see if this argument can be extended to naturalism as well, but let's just focus on the argument against non-naturalism for now. Okay, so why would it be the case that moral non-naturalism is immoral? Well, Hayward says that the problem is that non-naturalists conditionalize their moral commitments on the non-natural facts. According to non-naturalism, if it turns out that there are no non-natural facts, so if it turns out that the metaphysics of non-naturalism is mistaken, then nothing matters. There's nothing that we ought or ought not to do. This is explicitly endorsed by many non-naturalists. Derek Parfit, for example, claimed that if there are no irreducibly normative facts, then nothing matters, and there would be no better or worse ways to live. There would be nothing that we ought to do or ought not to do. We would have no moral obligations. So non-naturalists are conditionalizing their moral commitments on this speculative metaphysical hypothesis, right? If their metaphysics is wrong, if in fact naturalism is true and there is no place for non-natural facts, then morality is completely undermined. Morality is rejected. Now, the moral judgments that we make are revisable, and we sort of all recognise circumstances in which we would change our moral judgments. So Hayward gives the example that there are lots of things I owe my partner, right? So we might say that, if I'm in a romantic relationship with somebody, well, I ought to do nice things for her. I ought to support her in her projects in ways that I wouldn't just support random strangers. I ought to comfort her when she's in distress. So, I have special obligations to her because of our close relationship. Like if I see a random stranger crying, I'm not obligated to offer comfort. Indeed, it might even be, kind of creepy to offer comfort if it's just, somebody crying on the street or something. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are circumstances where you would think there's an obligation to offer comfort, but like you have greater obligations to people you're in relationships with. So yeah, I mean, if I see my partner crying, it would be considered cold and brutish to just ignore her. But now suppose that I discover that she's been cheating on me for the past 5 years. Well, then it's okay for me to behave more coldly. It's okay for me to be dismissive of her if I see her crying, or maybe even angry. That's Hayward's judgment on this. So, we have beliefs about what conditions would lead us to change particular moral judgments, right? Like under normal circumstances, I ought to comfort my partner when she's in distress, but if I discover that she's been cheating on me, I'm no longer under that obligation. Moreover, we assess people's moral sensibilities in terms of what conditions would lead them to change their moral judgments. So imagine that we both have the same sense of commitment to our partners. We both agree that if we see our partners in distress, we ought to make an effort to comfort them. But for me, this is conditionalised on fidelity, right? So if she cheats, it's okay for me to behave in ways that would otherwise be judged cold and rude. You, on the other hand, conditionalise your commitment not just on fidelity, but also on your partner maintaining a certain body mass index. As far as you're concerned, if your partner gets too fat or too thin, it's fine for you to become angry, to be rude, to dismiss her when she's in distress. Well, clearly, we have different moral viewpoints. As far as I'm concerned, your viewpoint is morally defective. You are morally vicious. I disapprove of your sensibility. Hayward gives a similar example of lying. So utilitarians and Kantians may agree that lying is wrong, but for a utilitarian, if lying is wrong, it's because it fails to maximise happiness for the greatest number of people. If the utilitarian were to come to believe that lying actually promoted utility, she would drop her opposition to lying. The Kantian would not. That's a substantive moral disagreement. As far as the Kantian is concerned, the utilitarian is wrong to conditionalise her opposition to lying on it having negative utility. The utilitarian is morally defective. So the defect consists in the fact that she would endorse lying if it turned out that lying promotes utility. So yeah, I mean, we make these sorts of judgments often, right? Like we recognise different sort of scenarios that would lead us to change our views, and we judge other people's moral sensibilities in terms of how they would respond to different scenarios. Now, Hayward then points out, well, there might be conditions under which it would turn out that we just have no moral obligations. So if we discover that there is no external world, if I discover that there's no external world and that all of my experiences are just hallucinations, well, arguably I don't have any moral obligations. Certainly it doesn't seem that there would be a moral obligation not to, go out and murder somebody, because I'm not actually murdering anybody, right? It's just, just be like a dream, right? I mean, you don't have any moral obligations in your dreams. Do whatever you want in your dreams, because you're not actually hurting anyone. But, putting these sorts of skeptical scenarios to one side, Hayward says it would be morally reprehensible to accept this kind of nihilism. And he gives a few examples of sort of views that kind of lead in this direction. So first of all, we frame this in terms of conditionals. And so we can first of all, this isn't Hayward's example, but I think it's instructive. There's what we might call the incels conditional. The incel being the involuntarily celibate people, who have. I think there's a few of them who've gone out and like shot people because they can't get dates. So we might imagine an incel thinking, if I can't get a date, then nothing matters, right? And like some of them seem to genuinely have this attitude. If they fail to get a date, then they just have no obligations to anybody. Screw the rest of the world. They don't owe anybody anything. It's okay for them to get a gun and go out and shoot people. Well, clearly this, I assume we think is morally vicious, right? Whether or not you can get a date, there are still other people with their own interests and concerns, and you still have obligations to them, right? It doesn't make any difference whether or not you can get a date. Of course, this isn't a carefully considered view. This is, in fact, probably this is just like an expression of rage. Perhaps the incel would really say something like, if I can't get a date, then I don't care about what matters. I don't care about my moral obligations. So the incel's conditional is not a view that professional philosophers are going to take that seriously. But there are similar views, or views with a similar structure, that professional philosophers do take seriously. So consider the theist's conditional. We sometimes hear theists give a moral argument for God. They will say that only God could provide the appropriate grounding for morality. So if God doesn't exist, then nothing matters. If God doesn't exist, there would be nothing wrong with killing, raping, pillaging. Now, that's not simply an expression of rage like you find in the incel. There are people who take this seriously as a philosophical thesis and who have considered arguments for and against it. But we can similarly object that this is morally defective. Regardless of whether or not God exists, the world is still full of people who can suffer. Torturing a person will cause them just as much pain, regardless of whether or not there's a God. To be prepared to abandon all of your commitments to other people simply on discovering that there's no God, that evinces a vicious attitude. So hopefully you can see how this works. Well, now there is the non-naturalists conditional. And the non-naturalists conditional, she says, if there are no non-natural facts, then nothing matters. If there are no non-natural facts, then there are no moral facts, and there is nothing we ought or ought not to do. As the non-naturalist sees it, since moral facts are non-natural, right, we might be wrong about there being moral facts, or wrong about what the moral facts are, without being wrong about any of the facts of the world we experience. Every natural fact could remain the same, right? So torturing somebody could cause just as much suffering, yet it would not be the case that I have any moral obligation not to torture them. And the objection is that this evinces a vicious attitude, in the same way that the incel's conditional and the theist's conditional evinces a vicious attitude. The non-naturalist's conditionalization of morality, of their moral commitments on the non-natural facts, is immoral. The truth or falsehood of naturalism makes no difference to our experiences, to the world in which we actually live, and the people we interact with. But surely that's what matters. So as Hayward puts it, if I were to drop my commitment to my partner, but every aspect of our history, every fact about her feelings and concerns stayed the same, that, I think, would constitute a deep betrayal. It's reasonable for me to drop my commitments, or at least some of my commitments, if it turns out that she's been cheating. It's not acceptable for me to drop my commitments if it turns out there's no God, or if it turns out that there are no non-natural moral facts. Of course, these are live possibilities. After all, there are plenty of philosophers who have mounted serious challenges to both theism and moral non-naturalism. So the moral objection to non-naturalism is that for non-naturalists, our moral commitments are hostage to their speculative metaphysics. There's something very strange about this. In fact, not just strange, but morally objectionable. It shouldn't make a difference to us whether or not there are non-natural facts. So I've presented this argument in terms of whether or not non-natural properties exist, but we can also say, even if non-natural properties do exist, we might also be mistaken about their distribution. And this kind of gives rise to a very, very similar, or maybe just another way of kind of putting the same point. So this point is made by David Enoch in his article, Thanks, We're Good. So we've seen this general conditional that the non-naturalist is committed to. If there are no non-natural properties, then nothing matters. But the non-naturalist is similarly committed to conditionals such as, if human pain and dog pain have no non-natural property in common, then dog pain is not intrinsically bad. Why? Well, intrinsic badness is a non-natural property, at least according to the non-naturalist. Let's assume that human pain is intrinsically bad. Well, if human pain shares no non-natural property with dog pain, then dog pain isn't intrinsically bad, right? So this is just a point that even if there are non-natural moral facts, these facts might be very different from what we expect. How should we respond to this situation? The moral non-naturalist would have to alter her moral commitments. A non-naturalist who was, initially committed to animal rights, on discovering that human pain and dog pain have no non-natural property in common, would have to conclude that there's actually nothing bad about dog pain. And again, that seems absurd. Nothing about the dog's experience is different, because the dog's experience is a natural property. That's the argument, right? As Hayward says, why should we care more about what a non-natural order of judgment-independent facts happens to support than we care about what we want, need, and feel? Right then, let's turn to some objections. Well, one potential objection, which is noted by Hayward, is that the non-naturalist might say that when we make claims about what we ought to do or about what matters, we just are making claims about non-natural facts. So the claim, I ought not to torture people for fun, that just is a non-natural fact. So, of course it's going to entail there are no non-natural facts. It's trivial that if there are no non-natural facts, then we have no moral obligations. That's just like saying, if we have no moral obligations, then we have no moral obligations. So the objection here is that the moral argument against non-naturalism assumes that there are two different kinds of things. So there's our moral obligations on the one hand and non-natural moral facts on the other. And then the non-naturalist conditionalizes the one kind of thing on the other. But as the non-naturalist sees it, these are not two different kinds of things, they're one and the same. The moral facts just are non-natural facts. Well, Hayward responds that this just begs the question. It assumes that moral properties are non-natural properties, and that's what's in question here, right? What's in question here is exactly whether moral properties should be identified with non-natural properties. And notice that establishing this involves very different considerations than establishing what our moral commitments are. The arguments concerning non-naturalism involve appeals to explanatory indispensability, parsimony, theories in epistemology and metaphysics and semantics and so on. And those are very different from the sort of considerations I make when I'm trying to work out my moral commitments, right? When I'm working out my moral commitments, I'm going to consider things like, does the action cause pain? Have people consented to the action? What effect is this going to have on other people? And so on. I think about things like that. I don't kind of engage in sort of sophisticated epistemology and metaphysics. And then, having thought about my moral commitments, I might then go on to ask what kind of things moral properties are, but these are clearly separate questions. So, Hayward says it just begs the question in this context to respond to the moral argument by assuming that moral properties just are natural properties, right? That's what is that's what is in question. Okay, a second objection is that the moral argument confuses the distinction between meta-ethics and normative ethics. So metaethics is concerned with the metaphysics, epistemology, and semantics of moral judgments. You know, what do people mean when they make moral statements? Are there objective moral facts, etc.? Metaethical questions are independent from normative ethics, from, like I said just a minute ago, from the kind of considerations we bring to bear on debates about what's right or wrong, about what we ought or ought not to do. The moral argument against realism is a normative argument. But this is just the wrong kind of argument to use in the context of metaethics, because even if moral non-naturalism is immoral, it may still be true. The moral argument simply doesn't show that the moral non-naturalist is mistaken in her description of the semantics or metaphysics of moral discourse. Right? It just doesn't show that she is incorrect in taking morality to involve a commitment to non-natural facts. So in response to this, Hayward says, well, let's just suppose that the non-naturalist is right in her description of moral language. So let's suppose that moral language really does attempt to describe non-natural facts. Well, all this shows is that our practice of morality is currently inconsistent. And the reason it's inconsistent is that the moral argument shows that we are morally prohibited from conditionalising our moral commitments on non-natural facts. In fact, nobody would change their moral commitments simply on coming to believe that there are no non-natural facts. And we can actually observe that plenty of people have converted from non-naturalism to some other position without thereby giving up their moral commitments. So yeah, the claim is that, all right, well, if the non-naturalist is right, that moral language attempts to describe non-natural facts, then that just shows that there's a kind of inconsistency in moral discourse. Because in fact, right, when we sort of think about this on a first order level, we morally ought not to conditionalise our moral commitments on non-natural facts. Now, having recognised this inconsistency, well, the best option surely is to reform our moral language, to change our commitments. There are other meta-ethical views available. If we think that moral non-naturalism is correct as an account of our present moral discourse, well, having identified that moral non-naturalism is problematic, we can endorse changing moral language. We can endorse using moral language differently so that we no longer talk as if we're describing a realm of non-natural facts. As Hayward says, the fact that we do speak one way does not entail that we should continue to speak that way. So the point here is there are different ways of evaluating meta-ethical theories, right? Moral non-naturalism may be true as a description of how people actually use moral language, but we can reject it as a prescription for how we ought to use moral language. And that's where the moral argument comes in. Since moral non-naturalism is immoral, we ought to think of our moral discourse differently. So that's Hayward's response, though I have to say I do wonder if he's underselling his argument here. Because we can also say, I think a point we can also make here is that, if people do not in fact take their moral commitments to be conditional on non-natural facts, indeed, if these conditional claims strike people as morally vicious, then it seems like that just in itself is evidence that non-naturalism is false as a description of moral discourse. So the moral argument is relevant to the question of the meaning of moral statements. After all, how do we go about establishing what the meaning of moral concepts is? Well, surely you'd need to look at how those concepts are used and the kind of inferences that people make with those concepts. So if people resist the inference from the absence of non-natural facts to the conclusion that nothing matters, if people resist that inference, that suggests that non-naturalist semantics is just descriptively incorrect. At least maybe. It seems like that might be another possible response to the objection. A third objection is that the moral argument is uncharitable to non-naturalists, because if non-naturalists were to come to accept naturalism, if they were to change their mind about there being non-natural properties, well, of course they wouldn't actually abandon their moral commitments, right? They would instead accept some other meta-ethical theory as second best, because most non-naturalists are more confident in their moral judgments than they are in their meta-ethics. David Enoch makes this point in his article, Thanks, We're Good. He draws an analogy to views in philosophy of mind. So suppose I believe that having a brain is necessary for having thoughts. I'm a mind-brain identity theorist. So I endorse the conditional. If I don't have a brain, I don't have thoughts. I may believe this conditional with great confidence, because let's just say I'm really confident that a necessary condition for having thoughts is having a brain. But then I discover that, in fact, my head is empty. I have no brain. Pretty shocking discovery, but I mean, it's conceptually possible, right? Like maybe I might make that discovery. Well, should I conclude that I don't have thoughts? Well, of course not. Instead, I should abandon the view that having a brain is necessary for having thoughts. So Enoch describes the conditional, which I've labelled B, as junk knowledge. It is known, right? It is a piece of knowledge, but I can't use it in inferences in a knowledge-producing way, because if I were to come to believe the antecedent, I wouldn't infer the consequent. Instead, I would reject the conditional. And that's reasonable because I'm much more confident in the falsity of the consequent, right? That I'm much more confident in the falsity of the claim that I don't have thoughts than I am in the truth of the conditional. I'm more confident that I have thoughts than I am in the claim that the mind-brain identity theory is true. The evidence that I have thoughts is very different and much more powerful than the evidence for the mind-brain identity theory. B, this conditional, it's kind of junk knowledge, right? Like it is a piece of knowledge. It's justified true belief, right? But it just can't be used to extend knowledge. We're not going to use it in inferences in the usual kind of way. I mean, actually, it just occurs to me now, after having written this script and everything, that this might not be a very good example, because I'm not really inclined to think that B actually does count as knowledge, and I think it's probably quite controversial to say that that it does. So if I don't have a brain, I don't have thoughts. That kind of the mind-brain identity theory is obviously a very controversial position, but hopefully you can see how this is supposed to work. So we can say the same for the non-naturalists' conditionals. Yes, the non-naturalist is committed to them, but they're junk knowledge, because if we were to come to believe the antecedents, if we were to come to believe the claim that there are no non-natural facts, then we would just reject the conditionals. So we would reject non-naturalism. We wouldn't give up our moral commitments. So, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point. The worry about this response is that it seems to just concede the point of the moral argument against realism. So Hayward says that non-naturalism has these morally objectionable consequences because of what it requires of us in certain counterfactual scenarios. Enoch simply accepts this, right? He accepts that, if we were to discover that the metaphysical facts are not as the non-naturalist takes them to be, then the non-naturalist cannot preserve our moral commitments. But it's precisely this that Hayward says is morally objectionable. Hayward notes that the moral argument is... So the point of the moral argument is not that non-naturalists are psychologically disposed to abandon their moral commitments should they discover that non-naturalism is false. I mean, it's probably the case that if a non-naturalist comes to think that there are no non-natural facts, she will give up the conditional rather than give up morality. So the moral argument is not making a psychological claim. The claim is that there is a problem with the theory. The claim is that non-naturalism as a theory has immoral implications. Hayward compares this to arguments against utilitarianism. So take the classic case of the trolley problem, where you have 5 people tied to a track. Well, actually, I say it's the classic case of the trolley problem. There are many trolley problems, but one version of the trolley problem involves 5 people tied to a track. You're on a bridge above the track, and there's also a very fat man who would be large enough to stop the trolley if you push him in front of it. So you can kill the fat man to save the 5 people tied to the track. Now, if utilitarianism is true, you ought to push the fat man. But the objection goes, pushing the fat man would be morally evil. That's the argument. Now, imagine a utilitarian responding, well, Of course, if I were to ever find myself in the situation described by the thought experiment, I wouldn't push the fat man, I would give up utilitarianism. You know, my commitment to not pushing the fat man is stronger than my commitment to utilitarianism. That response would miss the point. Indeed, that response would actually just concede the critic's argument. So yeah, it's not obvious that how this actually works as a response to the moral argument. A second point that Hayward makes here is that if the non-naturalist does have a second best option, then presumably this option must be capable of accounting for our moral commitments. So that is, on discovering that there are no non-natural facts, the non-naturalist thinks, oh, okay, well, I'll adopt naturalism or expressivism or constructivism or whatever, rather than just give up all my moral obligations. But if she does this, then she's acknowledging that this alternative meta-ethics does give a foundation for morality. But then why accept non-naturalism in the first place? Of course, different philosophers will be motivated by different arguments here, but I mean, non-naturalism incurs some pretty significant metaphysical and epistemological costs. And usually the argument in favour of taking on those costs is that they're necessary in order to make sense of the truth or objectivity or normativity or whatever of moral discourse. If the non-naturalist thinks that naturalism or expressivism can make sense of the truth and objectivity and normativity of moral discourse, then her main argument for non-naturalism is undercut. So by saying that, well, you know, in response to... by saying that, like, non-naturalists can just give up the conditional and adopt a sort of second-best meta-ethics, that perhaps challenges their reasons for being non-naturalists in the first place. Or so Hayward says. Right, well, that's Hayward's argument. Now, I've presented this so far in terms of moral non-naturalism. And I mean, Hayward specifically targets moral non-naturalism in the moral argument. What about moral naturalism, the other branch of moral realism? Well, I think that a very similar objection can actually be raised here. Now, initially, moral naturalism might seem to be immune from the moral argument. According to moral naturalists, moral properties are natural properties. Now, Hayward's objection to non-naturalism is that there might in principle be no non-natural facts without any change in the natural facts. Torturing a person for fun would still cause that person pain. You know, that person would still strongly desire not to be in such pain and so on, regardless of whether or not there's a non-natural fact to the effect that I ought not to torture people. Now, obviously, none of this is the case according to moral naturalism. The moral naturalist doesn't postulate these spooky non-natural facts, and it's perfectly sensible to think that if you change the natural facts, then you're going to change our moral obligations. If torture did not cause pain, well, yeah, obviously our moral assessment of torture would be different. But I think there's still a difficulty here for the moral naturalist, because so most naturalists will accept that although moral properties just are natural properties, there's still some conceptual difference between like moral concepts and natural property concepts, so moral beliefs and beliefs about natural properties. It may be that torturing somebody is wrong because it causes that person pain, right? But in saying torture causes pain, that in itself isn't making a moral judgment. After all, everybody agrees that torture causes pain, but not everybody agrees that torture is morally wrong. So, like, even if the pain is, like, even if the badness of torture just consists in the pain, right, and the moral property of badness is identified with the property of pain, so the moral property is a natural property, even in that case, right, to express the claim or the belief torture causes pain, that isn't in itself to make a moral judgment. There's a conceptual difference. So a useful analogy here is the claim that water is H2O, right? So most people will say water and H2O are identical. We have discovered that water just is H2O. Water is nothing over and above a collection of H2O molecules. You know, the terms water and H2O refer to the same things. However, we probably want to say that water and H2O are different concepts, because although they both refer to the same thing, there is still a difference in meaning. I mean, people in the past talked about water, but they had no idea what H2O was. And then they had to discover, right, through careful investigation that water was H2O. And even today, it's in principle possible that we might discover that water actually isn't H2O. I mean, we can imagine this scenario. It makes sense conceptually. Perhaps there will be some major paradigm shift that overthrows current chemistry, and then we find out actually water isn't H2O. It's something else entirely. So although we believe that water just is H2O, there appears to be a conceptual difference. And along the same lines then, moral properties can be natural properties, but moral concepts are not synonymous with any natural property concept. So like bad would not be synonymous with pain, even if badness just is pain. Now, since moral concepts and natural property concepts differ, moral naturalists will need to endorse kind of identity claims. So they'll need to say, okay, moral properties are identical to or are constituted by these natural properties. Moral naturalists are going to be committed to what we might call moral bridge laws. And these bridge laws will tell us which natural properties are identified with which moral properties. A very simple naturalist view would say goodness is pleasure, badness is pain. Right, that's it. Torturing a person for fun is bad because it causes pain, and the pain is constitutive of the moral badness. And we're assuming that this isn't outweighed by a sufficient amount of pleasure elsewhere. Well, a lot of moral naturalists are going to want to say something a bit more sophisticated than this. I mean, maybe we should draw a distinction between higher and lower pleasures, or maybe goodness and badness are constituted by states other than just raw experiences. I mean, if you think that it would be bad to get into Nozick's experience machine, then the moral naturalist is not going to want to accept this simple view. But the details here don't really matter, right? The point is the naturalist is going to be committed to these moral bridge laws. And they might be quite detailed, they might be quite sophisticated, but these are going to be bridge laws that identify the moral properties with natural properties. Well, now we can ask, okay, what if we discover that we're just completely wrong about what the moral bridge laws are? So maybe it turns out that what's morally good is aggression, competition, violence towards the weak, conformity with traditional sexual norms. So it seems like we should at least acknowledge the epistemic possibility that we might be wrong. I mean, after all, there's plenty of debate among moral naturalists about the content of moral bridge laws, right? It's, there's different people are going to hold different views already. And we know that with other cases of property identification, like the identification of, water with H2O, well, in those cases we could be wrong. So it seems like we should acknowledge the epistemic possibility, right, that we might turn out to be wrong about what the content of these bridge laws are. Indeed, what if we discover that actually we can't really make sense of the notion of moral bridge laws at all? So moral naturalists have made many different proposals for how moral properties might be identified with natural properties, but all of these are controversial. For example, you can check out my video on Immoral Realism, and if you do that, you will see that there is they have proposed a very sophisticated program for identifying essentially the moral bridge laws, right? For identifying which natural properties are the moral properties. But their program rests on some pretty controversial views in semantics, right? Like maybe it turns out that actually this whole project of identifying moral bridge laws is just mistaken, right? And there just are no moral bridge laws. Okay, so with this in mind, I think we can state the moral argument against naturalism. Recall that the objection to non-naturalism is that the non-naturalist conditionalizes her moral commitments on the existence of non-natural properties. So she is committed to conditionals such as, if there are no non-natural properties, then nothing matters. Or, if human pain and dog pain have no non-natural property in common, then dog pain is not intrinsically bad. She's committed to conditionals like that. Well, the naturalist conditionalizes her commitments on the moral bridge laws, the laws identifying moral properties with natural properties. The very existence of such bridge laws depends on controversial semantic claims, controversial claims about the meanings of our terms, and even if there are such laws, there's much debate about their content. So that the naturalist has conditionalised her commitments on these bridge laws. But now consider, so she's committed to conditionals like, if there are no moral bridge laws, then nothing matters. Or, if the moral bridge laws are different from what we think, then our moral obligations will be different. If the moral bridge law identifies goodness with aggression, competition and selfishness, then we ought not to give to charity. But even if the moral bridge laws were different or non-existent, the natural properties of actions would be exactly the same. Even if it turns out that there's a bridge law identifying aggression, competition and selfishness as good, there are still people suffering, people in need, people who we are capable of helping at little cost to ourselves. Even if it turns out that there's a bridge law identifying deviant sexualities as bad, it's still the case that engaging in gay sex doesn't hurt anybody, and some people get a lot of pleasure from it. So to conditionalise your moral commitments on the existence and content of moral bridge laws evinces a vicious attitude, in the same way as we saw with the theists' conditional and the non-naturalists' conditional. Moral bridge laws shouldn't matter. You shouldn't care what the moral bridge laws are. And since naturalism makes moral commitments depend on these moral bridge laws, naturalism is immoral. So, we have seen a moral argument against non-naturalism, and perhaps there's also a moral argument against naturalism. So, there you have it. There is the moral argument against moral realism. And that is all for today, so thanks for watching.